Now, we had talked about the Ottoman and Safavid and Mughal Empire and how they were all Muslim and they're all gunpowder empires. Now, this doesn't mean that they're the only gunpowder empires in existence. We also have one more gunpowder empire, but that empire is not Muslim. Okay, what's the fourth gunpowder empire? Russia, exactly right. And they are Christian, specifically Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. Okay, so these are not the only gunpowder empires that are in existence, but they are the only Muslim gunpowder empires. Now, like the Russians, these empires all trace back their heritage to the Mongols. Okay, the Mongols had moved into Russia with the Golden Horde and established tributary states, which Russia was not able to overthrow until 1462. The Mongols had moved into Persia and established the Ilk Khanate. And so you have Ottoman influence or Mongol influence on the Ottomans and Mongol influence on the Safavid. Obviously, there's Mongol influence on the Mughal Empire because Mughal is a derivative of the word Mongol. Okay, so that's one similarity that they all share, even Russia, is that they're influenced by the Mongols. Another similarity between these three is the fact that they're all Muslim. However, they are different branches of Islam, and they enforce religion differently. Okay? All of these empires are ethnically diverse, but the Ottoman and Mughal Empire are very religiously diverse, as well as religiously tolerant. Okay? If you wanted to be Christian or Jewish or anything other than Muslim in the Ottoman Empire, you were allowed to worship whatever faith you wanted. You just had to pay a tax known as the jizya. In the Mughal Empire, the majority of the northern half of India was Muslim, and the majority of the southern half of India was Hindu, but you also have syncretic religions like Sufism and Sikhism that emerged, that merge Hinduism and Islam together to create something new. So the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman empires were mostly religiously tolerant. We do see some instances where they revert to religious intolerance, but for the most part, overall, they are religiously tolerant. The Safavid Empire, however, was very, very strict and said, you're Shia or you're out. Okay, so the Safavid Empire was not religiously tolerant, which is one of the factors that led in its very rapid decline. The Safavid Empire is the shortest lived of these three Muslim gunpowder empires. The Ottoman is the longest lived. It lasted for over 600 years. Okay, the Safavid lasted much, much shorter time in comparison. Part of that is political and social unrest due to their religious policies, but also geographically, the Safavid Empire was smack dab in the middle between two very powerful expansionist empires. And so as the Ottoman Empire expands and the Mughal Empire expands, it moves into Safavid territory. Okay, so it's the smallest and the shortest lived for those two reasons. Now, in contrast to Russia, the Muslim gunpowder empires are going to resist modernization. They're going to be slow to modernize or fail to modernize in favor of preserving their traditional culture. Whereas in Russia, they did the complete opposite. Peter the Great was like, let's yeet out all of our traditions. Let's get rid of the old believers. Let's get rid of beards and let's become westernized. Let's modernize as quickly as possible. So Russia, as a gunpowder empire, is going to rapidly modernize. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires are going to resist modernization, even going so far as to ban coffee houses as dens of iniquity. Okay, so we see that factor into their decline as well. The rest of the world is modernizing and industrializing, and the Muslim gunpowder empires are going to be left behind, with eventually the Ottoman Empire becoming the sick man of Europe, finally falling officially in 1923 following World War I, where it was divided amongst the Europeans under new imperialism. Now we're going to get into specifics with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the longest lived of these gunpowder empires. It lasted over 600 years, starting in 1299 and then ending after World War I. Remember that after World War I, Turkey became the country, and the rest of that territory was divvied up amongst the Europeans. Okay, so they added to their empire. At its peak, however, the Ottoman Empire covered 3 different continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. So how did the empire come to be? Well, they started out as nomadic warriors. Okay, and this group of nomadic Ottoman Turks were led by their chief. That's what Bey means. It doesn't mean before anyone else or Beyonce. Okay, Bey in this context means chief. Okay, so their chief was Osman. This is where we get the name Ottoman. Osman, Ottoman. Okay, he led this nomadic group into Anatolia and eventually settled down, declaring himself the Sultan, declaring himself the leader of this empire. And he wanted to follow the Ghazi ideal. This is in your outline. The Ghazi ideal was being a Muslim religious warrior. Okay, you live a warrior life, live a nomadic life, and you're the sword of Allah. You're a holy fighter for Islam. So spreading the Islamic faith through military means. Okay, now we can see their ties back to the Mongol Empire through this Ghazi ideal. The Mongols were warriors. The Mongols were nomadic. How they differ is that Osman and the Ottomans were actually good at administration. So they were able to build up a empire that would last longer than the Mongol Empire did. And he's going to continue to have expansion and military feats that he adds to his resume. In 1326, he conquers the capital Bursa, B-U-R-S-A. And this is going to become a major trade and intellectual center in the Ottoman Empire. Then in 1352, he's going to conquer Gallipoli in Europe. Okay, so they're going to be threatening the European countries, the European empires. Although at this time, from the 1300s into the 1450s, Europe is still in the Dark Ages, Crusades, bubonic plague. Okay, not a lot of intellectual activity going on. So the Europeans aren't top dog yet. They're still in their Dark Ages. They haven't gone through the Renaissance. After Osman, decades later, okay, we move on to the next famous sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed II. He's called Mehmed the Conqueror because his main claim to fame is conquering Constantinople. This is something that others had tried and failed to do. The Seljuk Turks tried to invade Constantinople. They failed. The Mongols tried to invade Constantinople, and they failed. But the Ottoman Turks are successful. So in 1453, he used siege weapons like cannons and gunpowder technology to break through the city walls and end the Byzantine Empire. Thus, he became the warrior sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was known as the ruler of the 2 lands, meaning he controlled land in Europe and in Asia. He controlled the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So he's the ruler of the 2 lands and the 2 seas. And he is going to continue his invasion into European land because remember, the Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. It's European. Now it's the Ottomans. So he is moving into Europe. He even moves into Italy, but that's where he's going to stop. He's not going to be able to move farther into Europe past Italy. He is, however, going to keep tight control. He is an absolute ruler. Everyone has to report back to him, the Sultan. In fact, he passes a law saying that the ruler can kill off all of his brothers when he takes the throne. Because remember, it wasn't clear who was supposed to inherit the throne. It had to be the favorite son, and there were a lot of sons. And so to eliminate that competition, the sultans start killing their own brothers. Now, it's taboo to spill royal blood, so they couldn't stab them or shoot them or behead them. So instead, one of the most common ways to assassinate your brothers was to use a silk bowstring and strangle them with it, so there was no blood spilled. In 1595, a new sultan is going to kill 18 of his brothers, including infant brothers, and 15 expectant mothers. Okay, but that was part of the tradition. It was a part of maintaining centralized rule. You have to get rid of anyone who is a threat to your power. However, this is very clearly going to have some negative consequences. One of those negative consequences is that the princes are kept within the palace. They're kept protected because assassination attempts are made on their lives. This means that they're not going to get a lot of real life experience, including experience in leadership. So one of the big factors that results in the fall of the Ottoman Empire is a series of weak leaders, which you can see how this happened since their leaders are constantly being attacked by their siblings. And they're not able to expand and get that leadership training that they otherwise might get in the real world. So this law that Mehmed passes is actually going to backfire a bit. So why is it historically significant that the Ottomans conquered the Byzantine Empire? Well, y'all may remember that Constantinople was a huge trade city. Now the Ottomans have control of that trade. So this is going to make the Ottoman Empire very wealthy and very powerful. They changed the capital's name from Constantinople to Istanbul and make it the new capital of their empire. This is representing a lot of continuity and change over time. In terms of continuity, this city, Constantinople/Istanbul, remains a trade city. That is a continuity. Well, what about change over time? Well, y'all, there's huge political and religious changes. What was the big religious change with the conquering of Constantinople? What religion was the Byzantine Empire?
Eastern Orthodox?
Eastern Orthodox, exactly right. What religion is Istanbul going to be? What religion is the Ottoman Empire, y'all? Muslim, good. So you have a change over time in religion. The Byzantine Empire was Eastern Orthodox, Christian. Now it's Sunni Muslim, not Christian. Okay, the famous Christian church built by Justinian the Great, okay, between 527 and 565 was the Hagia Sophia. Once the Ottoman Empire takes over, it becomes the Hagia Sophia. This is no longer a Christian church. Now it is a Muslim house of worship. What do we call a Muslim house of worship? We don't call it a church. We call it, yes, a mosque. Okay? So it changes from being a Christian church to a Muslim mosque. That is a big religious change. Political change. Used to be a European empire. Now it's a Muslim empire, a gunpowder empire. So you have political change, no more emperor. Now you have a sultan. And you have a religious change. No more Christianity. Now it's Islam. But there is a continuity in the fact that it remains a center of trade. The next ruler we're going to talk about is Selim the Grim. Now, he's significant even though he only ruled for 8 years. He ruled from 1512 until 1520. He is going to expand the empire, moving into Syria and Egypt in Africa, and conquering Mecca and Medina. Why is it significant that he conquered those two specific cities? What's so important about Mecca and Medina? They were centers for trade, but they're also the birthplace of what religion? Islam, exactly right. This is where the Prophet Muhammad came from. In 622, he went to Mecca with the Quran teaching about Islam. He was kicked out of Mecca. So he ran to Medina, where he raised an army. Okay, Medina had formerly been called Yathrib, but now it's Medina, called the city of the Prophet. He took that army and went back to Mecca and conquered it for Allah. So he's not only a religious leader, but he's also a political leader. And so Selim the Grim wants to imitate that. He doesn't want to just be a political leader, he wants to be a religious leader. So he's going to take on the title of caliph. Remember, the last caliph had been killed in 1258 when the Mongols took over the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate. So there hasn't been a caliph since 1258. Selim is going to be the new caliph. So he's a sultan and a caliph. He is a political and a religious ruler. Okay, so this is forming a theocracy where religion and government go hand in hand instead of being separated. Now, as the caliph, he is going to change the policy of religious toleration. He is going to start persecuting Shia believers or Shiites in the Ottoman Empire, and he's going to try to invade the Shiite empire of the Safavid, who are over here further east of him. Okay, so there's going to be some conflict between those two Muslim gunpowder empires. But after Selim dies, his successor is Suleiman the Magnificent. Okay, he can be spelled this way with an umlaut over the U, or it can be spelled this way with an I instead of a Y. Okay, Suleiman the Magnificent must mean he's pretty great, right? And what do great rulers tend to do, like Catherine the Great and Justinian the Great? They tend to codify the law system. So he's called the lawgiver, Suleiman the lawgiver or Suleiman the Magnificent, because he issues a number of kanun. Okay, kanun are laws or edicts. Like Catherine the Great and Justinian the Great, what the major greats do is typically they're going to revamp the legal system, codify the legal system. Suleiman is going to be no different. In addition to being known as the Magnificent, he's also known as the lawgiver. Okay, he is going to standardize the legal system in the Ottoman Empire, filling in the blanks where Sharia law can't address certain cases. He is going to continue to expand the Ottoman Empire, moving into Safavid territory with the conquering of Baghdad and the Tigris and the Euphrates River. He is going to move into Europe, but he's going to be stopped at the Battle of Vienna. Okay, so that's as far as he's going to be able to move into Europe, but he is going to be a huge threat to the Europeans, especially in terms of maritime trade, as he advances his navy to become a major threat to the Portuguese navy. So a harem is a group of women, specifically the wives and girlfriends of the Sultan. Okay, so his wives and concubines, of which he had many. Okay, polygamy is a thing. They are all going to live in the palace together. And so he's going to have a lot of children from these concubines and wives in this harem as well. Okay, now in Europe, they follow a process of inheritance known as primogeniture. Okay, who can tell me what primogeniture is? The oldest son takes it all. Okay, the firstborn gets everything. So when the King of France dies, he doesn't divide up his empire into many Frances to divide amongst his 5 sons. He just says, okay, the oldest one gets everything. The rest of y'all better go marry rich or something. Okay? And it's a patriarchal society where it's always the eldest son, not the eldest child or daughter. Now, the Ottoman Empire is similarly patriarchal, but instead of focusing on the eldest son or the eldest legitimate son through a marriage, they're going to allow the favorite son to take everything. So the Sultan can pick which of his sons is his favorite, whether it's the oldest or the middle or the youngest, and they get to take over the empire. Now, this means that women in the harem are going to wield considerable political and social influence as they try to maneuver the political landscape to put their child at the top of the list. Okay, one of the most notable examples is Roxolana, okay, or Harem Sultana. Roxolana was a Ukrainian concubine who was Suleiman's favorite member of the harem. Okay, so she was his top girlfriend. And so as a result, she was able to consult him on state policies and laws. She even convinced him to execute his eldest son for treason, thus promoting her own son with him okay, as a potential heir to the empire. And after her death, she was buried with him in an Istanbul mosque. Okay, so as the favorite girlfriend, Roxolana held considerable political influence even in this patriarchal society. Now, one of the flaws of this harem politics system is that with all of these different factions developing, you're going to see a lot of underhanded, dirty politics occur. Okay, so like assassinations of the children of the Sultan are going to be very common. Okay, as one concubine tries to murder the child of another concubine in order to increase their own political influence. That kind of infighting and those different political factions coming in and leading to these assassinations is actually going to lead to the decline of the Ottoman Empire politically, okay, because it's going to be so fragmented. This is going to be problematic later down the line. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent is going to hit its peak. However, it is going to be limited in terms of how far into Europe it's able to expand. Okay. So one way that rulers like to legitimize their rule is by conquering, showing how powerful they are by expanding the empire. But by 1529, Suleiman is going to be limited at the Battle of Vienna and not going to be able to move further into Europe, although they still present a threat to Europe. So another way that rulers tend to legitimize their power is through the building of infrastructure. Now, the building of infrastructure can legitimize your power by showing how wealthy you are, by showing how much ability you have to command an empire to build such beautiful infrastructure, but also it can legitimize your rule through religion, specifically if you build religious infrastructure. Now, we've seen this before. Justinian the Great built the Hippodrome to show off his wealth and power. He also built the Hagia Sophia to link his rule with the church. Ivan IV built St. Basil's Cathedral to link his power to the church. Louis XIV built the Palace of Versailles to show off his wealth and to awe and inspire people as the absolute ruler of France. So no matter what empire we're talking about or what time period we're talking about, you're always going to see rulers try to legitimize their rule, most often through infrastructure. Now, two examples of this in the Ottoman Empire are the Topkapi Palace, which was a palace built in the capital of Istanbul. So the Topkapi Palace and the Suleimani Mosque. Now, the Suleimani Mosque was built in 1556 by the Sinan Pasha, and it is a a place of worship in the Islamic faith. Okay, so once again, that's a link to religious legitimization of your rule. But also the Topkapi Palace had some links to Islam as well as bolstering political rule through the magnificence of the infrastructure. Okay, so a process to beautify the capital city in order to increase power. And so the Ottoman Empire is going to peak under Suleiman's rule, both in terms of the size of the empire and the luxury and magnificence that the empire is able to show. Now, as an empire that rules over 3 continents, okay, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, okay, you have a lot of different people with a lot of different religions in this one empire. And so one of the keys to maintaining power and quelling any social or political unrest is by instituting a policy of religious toleration. So as the Ottoman Empire moves into these areas, as they move into Africa, or as they conquer the Byzantine Empire, they do not force people to convert to Islam. Okay, it's not a requirement. You can keep your own religious beliefs as the protected people of the Ottoman Empire, or the dhimmi of the Ottoman Empire. These protected people would often live in millets within the empire. These are autonomous or independent religious communities. Okay, the people who lived in these communities could maintain their property, their religion, their personal freedom, their languages, their traditions, as long as they paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire. And that tribute was in the form of the jizya tax. This is a tax against non-Muslims. So let's say you live in the Balkans and the Ottomans come in and take over, and you're Eastern Orthodox. You can continue to be Eastern Orthodox. You just have to pay a tax every year. If you live in Africa, okay, and you're a part of a Bantu polytheistic religion, okay, you can continue to practice that religion. You just have to pay a tax to the Sultan. Okay, but if you're Muslim, you don't have to pay that tax. So this is an example of religious toleration. Now, throughout most of the Ottoman Empire's history, they are going to be religiously tolerant. You are going to have some sultans that try to revert that, and it's going to end badly. Okay, but for the most part, they are religiously tolerant. This is what allows these huge empires to maintain control over this expanse of land, which is part of the reason why the Safavid Empire, in contrast, is very, very small, because they tried to force Shia conversion onto the population and eventually are going to be overthrown because of that in a religious and political revolt. Okay, it's critically important that you remember the jizya. Now, here are some pictures of the Topkapi Palace. So we can see some cultural syncretism in this infrastructure. Okay, so for instance, we see influence from the East in the geometric patterns. Do we see any icons or paintings of religious figures or gods? No, okay, because in the East they were iconoclastic. Instead, they have geometric patterns and calligraphy. Remember that calligraphy is very fancy writing. And you'll notice that the calligraphy on the walls is Arabic. Okay, so again, ties to the East, specifically the Middle East. However, we do see some influence from the West, specifically from Rome. Okay, what aspects of this building shows Roman influence? Arches, good. Arches and columns, or these pillars that you see here. And you may be able to pinpoint a dome here in the distance as a part of that palace. So domes, arches, and columns, that's influence from the West. Calligraphy, iconoclasm, geometric patterns, that's influence from the East. Also, the Suleimani Mosque, we see a similar connection to syncretism. We see domes, which are obviously from the West as they were spread through Hellenization with the conquest of Alexander the Great. But we also see Eastern influences, once again with the geometric patterns and the iconoclasm, but also with these minarets, which remember are towers attached to mosques for the muezzin to call for the 5 prayers each day. So cultural syncretism there as well. What was the purpose of the Suleimani Mosque? It was to legitimize power. Legitimize the power of the ruler by tying it to the majority religion of the empire. So geographically and culturally, all 3 of these continents are going to be linked together: Europe, Africa, and Asia. This is where we get the idea of the Ottoman Empire being both ethnically and religiously diverse. You're going to have multiple monotheistic religions and multiple polytheistic religions that are a part of this empire, okay? With the majority, however, being Muslim, due to the jizya tax encouraging but not forcing conversions. Now, we are going to see some level of forced conversions in this new social system that emerges under the Ottoman Empire, known as the Devshirme system. Okay, as Suleiman expands the empire, he wants to continue expanding the military. And one way to do this is by taking young Christian boys from the Balkans, okay, so male children, anywhere from the ages of 6 or 8 to 20, taking them back to the capital and making them slaves of the Sultan. Now, specifically, these slaves were to serve in the military to serve the Sultan. So this is similar to serfdom, okay? Serfdom in Europe, there were people who did coerced labor working the fields. In the Devshirme system in the Ottoman Empire, there are going to be people doing forced labor for the military, becoming trained as soldiers and representatives of the Ottoman Empire. But it's not going to be similar to what we see with the Asiento or the American version of slavery in the New World. It's not going to be nearly as brutal. In fact, the Devshirme system allows for social mobility. Christian families in the Balkans are actually going to compete to have their boys taken for the Janissary system. Okay? So under the Devshirme system, this was a form of conscription. Conscription is a fancy word for draft. Okay, y'all may remember that in the Vietnam War, the United States held a draft where all men ages I think it was 18 to 45 or somewhere within that range, they had to report for military service. Okay, similar to once y'all young men turn 18, you're going to have to register for the selective service. If you want to be able to register to vote or to receive federal student loans, you have to go through the selective service, so that in case we do have a war and there's a draft, they'll have names to pull from. Okay, so this is what the Devshirme system is. It is a draft. The Ottoman Empire moves into the Balkans and conquers it, and they round up young Christian boys. They convert them to Islam, they teach them the Turkish language, and they give them special training to enter into the government as a part of the bureaucracy or to enter into the military. Okay, now if you entered into the military under the Devshirme, you became a janissary or a soldier. This comes from the Turkish word yeniçeri, which means new soldiers. Okay, so new troops. So the yeniçeri or janissaries became the elite military forces in the Ottoman Empire. These were the military forces that were outfitted with gunpowder technology, which is going to make them very, very powerful. So this Devshirme system had begun in the 1300s, but Suleiman the Magnificent is going to expand it into the 15th and 16th century. So these janissaries are supposed to be ultra loyal to the Sultan. They're trained from a very young age as children to be loyal to the Ottoman government. Now, they are going to be restricted in certain rights. They're not allowed to wear beards. That's something that free Muslims do. And up until 1566, they weren't even allowed to marry and have families. Okay? But as they start increasing in power as an elite military force, they're going to start demanding more and more rights. And in fact, they're going to use their gunpowder weapons to eventually overthrow the Sultan. So that's going to be another factor in the decline of the Ottoman Empire. But at first, at the emergence of this system, they were ultra loyal to the Sultan and they served the Sultan. However, even though they were technically limited in certain rights, this doesn't mean that it was all bad. The Janissary system allowed for social mobility. That's why these Christian families would compete to have their child chosen for the Devshirme system. Because if they stayed at home, they would just be a peasant for the rest of their life, never become educated, never become trained. If they're taken into the Devshirme system, they're trained as soldiers and bureaucrats. And just because you're a slave to the Sultan doesn't mean you don't have a lot of political and social power and also wealth. Okay, so this allowed for social mobility in direct contrast to what we see in serfdom, which doesn't allow for any social mobility. So the Devshirme allows for moving upward in society, and so many Christian families actually want their children to be taken into this system as a form of tribute to the Ottoman Empire. Now, as the Janissaries rise in influence, this is going to bring them into competition with another very influential group in the Ottoman Empire, and that would be the Ulama, U-L-A-M-A. The Ulama were the religious scholars and experts. Okay, so they were experts in Islamic law, such as Sharia law. And as members of the religion, okay, the religious clergy, they were held in very high esteem. Y'all may remember that this is true in every society. Okay, doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Orthodox or polytheistic, the members of the religious branch of society are near the top of that social hierarchy. For instance, with the estates in France, the first and second estate, the nobles and the clergy, didn't have to pay taxes, whereas everyone else did. So the ulama in the Ottoman Empire are of very high status. They are Islamic experts and scholars. As the Janissaries start rising in power and influence, they're going to come into competition with the ulama because there's only so much power to go around. So yet another power struggle that is going to emerge. So what's the benefit of these Janissaries if they're going to lead to all this competition? Well, as a large empire, the Sultan needs to exact tribute and taxes from his holdings, but he can't be everywhere at once. And so this Devshirme system allows the Sultan to control these tributary states by sending in his Janissaries to make sure that the chiefs of those states are collecting taxes appropriately and sending back the appropriate amount to the Sultan. So these military soldiers, the Janissaries, are sent to control the local leaders, to enforce the laws of the Sultan. And in that way, the Ottomans receive tribute from these holdings and control trade in these holdings. However, as the Ottoman Empire starts demanding more taxes, okay, these governments are going to raise their taxes, but they're not going to tax the people in power, like the nobles or the people with money. They're going to raise taxes on the people with the least amount of money, which we've seen before. In France, there were 3 estates, the first, second, and third. Which one had the least amount of money? The third. And yet, which one paid literally all the taxes? The third, which is not a good move for increasing your tax revenue. Okay, you shouldn't tax the people with the least amount of money because you're not going to get a lot of money out of them. Okay, and so the burden of taxes in the Ottoman Empire is going to increase on the peasants, which means the Ottoman Empire is not making as much money. So in order to counterbalance that, they're going to enter into trade agreements with the Europeans, which are unfortunately going to lean towards benefiting the Europeans at the expense of the Ottomans. For instance, the Suez Canal, which y'all may be familiar with because of the big boat that blocked it. The Suez Canal was built as a contract between the Europeans and the Ottomans. And yet the Europeans benefited the most out of that contract. So taking advantage of the Ottoman Empire. They're going to do the same thing with Germany, with the building of a railroad system that eventually never gets built. Okay, so the Europeans are going to take advantage of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire entered into these trade agreements because they weren't collecting enough tax revenue because they were taxing the people with the least money. And another drawback to the Devshirme system is that people don't like being parts of coerced labor. Even though they rise in status and they get wealth and clout and power, you still don't want to be a slave to the Sultan. So these Janissaries are going to demand more rights, and they're going to use their gunpowder technology to successfully take over the Sultanate and end the Devshirme system once and for all. Okay, so these gunpowder weapons are going to be turned on the Sultan because these elite military forces are highly trained with this type of weaponry. And so we're going to see a continuity across all 3 of these Muslim gunpowder empires, whether it's the Safavid, the Mughal, or the Ottoman. The absolute rulers, okay, are going to be in a constant power struggle with the military elite. Now, this is a new spin on the continuity we talked about in Europe, where the absolute rulers are in a constant power struggle with the nobles. Well, here it's a little different. Here it's the absolute rulers, like the Sultan, in conflict with the military elite, like the Janissaries. Okay, so that's a similarity that we're going to see across all 3 of these Islamic gunpowder empires. So it takes centuries for the Ottoman Empire to finally, officially fall apart in 1923, which is how we get the country Turkey. And then the rest of that Ottoman territory is going to be carved up and divided up amongst the European powers in new imperialism, which remember is in period 3. Okay, so first we're going to talk about how great it was under Suleiman, and then we're going to talk about its decline. So what made Suleiman the Magnificent so magnificent? Well, he wasn't just a ruler who embodied the Ghazi ideal. Okay, and remember, what is the Ghazi ideal? The warrior life. Good. This was the ideal that we tied to Osman Bey, okay, the first chief of the Ottoman Empire in 1299 when he first established the Ottoman Empire. That's where we get the name Ottoman, is from Osman. Okay, now the warrior ideal was being a sword for Allah. They moved from being nomadic to being a settled society, eventually conquering Constantinople and establishing Istanbul. And Suleiman the Magnificent fit that warrior ideal. Okay, he was a fighter. So, but not only was he a great military campaigner or a man of the sword, as former sultans had been, he also differed from them in the extent to which he was also a man of the pen, meaning a man of high intellect. So he was educated. He wasn't just brute force and military strategy. Okay, he was also a very capable administrator. He was a great legislator. This is what gives him his nickname, the lawgiver. He is going to write a series of canons or laws that covers cases that fall outside of Sharia law. Now remember, Sharia law is Islamic jurisprudence, okay, that covers almost every aspect of life. So this is a theocracy, y'all. The government and religion are not separate. They are one and the same. In fact, Selim the Grim actually reclaimed the title of caliph, which, remember, a caliph is a political and religious leader within the Sunni religious faith. Okay, and that was not a title that had been used since 1258 when the Mongols had executed the last Abbasid caliph. So Selim the Grim reclaims that title, meaning he is a sultan, which is political, and a caliph, which has religious significance for the Sunni. So it is a theocracy. They're one and the same. So he was a great legislator, standing out in the eyes of his people as a high-minded sovereign. High-minded meaning intellectual, smart. And what does sovereign mean? An absolute ruler. Good. A king or a monarch. And a magnanimous exponent of justice. What does magnanimous mean? You'll do some last-minute membing. Okay, to be magnanimous means to be generous. Okay, so he is a generous king and a generous enforcer of justice. Hence his title, Suleiman the Magnificent / Suleiman the Lawgiver. Okay, and so he is going to institute these canons. And in this, he codifies the legal system, okay, in areas that aren't yet covered by Sharia law, which, remember, Sharia law is Islamic jurisprudence in all aspects of life. And in order to bolster this connection to Islam within the empire, he is going to make it a requirement that bureaucrats, and remember, bureaucrats is just another word for government worker. He's going to make it so that government workers are required to study Islamic law. Okay, remember, we have Islamic scholars or experts known as the ulama. Okay, these are Islamic scholars and experts. They're going to be similar to the old believers. Okay, how are the ulama similar to the old believers in Russia? They are conservative traditionalists. Okay, the old believers were Slavophilists. They believed that Russian culture was fine the way it was and that we don't need any modernization. The ulama are going to be the same way. The ulama are going to say we need to maintain our traditional culture and our values. Okay, so that's going to be one of the main differences between Russia as a gunpowder empire and the Muslim gunpowder empires, is that Russia rapidly modernizes. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, they westernized. They overruled the old believers. Y'all may remember that the old believers in Russia were in conflict with the Tsar because the Tsar wanted modernization. So it was an issue of tradition versus modernization. The same thing is going to come into play in the Ottoman Empire. The ulama are pro-tradition. They're going to be competing with the Janissaries, who are modernized. Now, the Janissaries are the military elite in the Ottoman Empire. They're outfitted with modern weaponry, like gunpowder weaponry. Okay, and so they're going to come into direct power conflict with the ulama because both of these groups want more power in the government, and they both want different things. The ulama want more traditional values, the Janissaries want more modernization, and also they don't want to be a part of the Devshirme system. They want more rights. So this is how the ulama tie into this. Suleiman the Magnificent codified the legal system and made it a requirement that the bureaucrats, the government workers in his government, study Islamic law, study Sharia law. That makes this a theocracy. The religion and the government are one and the same. The religious laws are the secular laws. There is no separation. The political leader is also the religious leader. There is no separation. Now, whereas Russia rapidly modernized and rapidly westernized, the Ottoman Empire and the other Muslim gunpowder empires are not going to modernize. They're going to fail to modernize. And that's going to be a contributor to their eventual decline as the Europeans become stronger and stronger. Okay, one example of this. How did the Ottoman Empire resist modernization? Well, Sultan Murad IV banned coffee houses. Y'all may remember at the beginning of the lecture, we talked about how coffee and tobacco are cash crops that are grown in the New World. Now, tobacco originated in the New World, but coffee originated in Ethiopia. Okay, but both of them are going to be grown in plantations in the New World as cash crops. And nicotine and caffeine are going to be very, very popular within the Ottoman Empire, hence the rise of coffee houses. But the scholars of Sharia law are going to claim that coffee houses are dens of iniquity, or places where bad morality occurs. And so they're going to try to ban these coffee houses on pain of death. However, despite that threat, despite that ban, coffee houses are going to continue to thrive. Okay, but this is a constant power struggle, okay, between the traditionalists and the people who want to become more modernized. So Sultan Murad IV is pro-tradition, anti-modernization. And that lack of modernization is going to be one of the contributing factors to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was very, very big. It expanded across 3 continents. It had territory in Europe with the Byzantine Empire, it had territory in Africa, and it had territory in Asia with the Middle East. Okay, how does one person control such expansive territory? Well, you have to set up a hierarchy in government where everybody has a job, but they report back to you. So establishing a system where you have governors who rule over a territory but report back to you. The same thing works in our government. Yes, we have a president, but at the head of each state, we have a governor. But the governors have to follow federal law. Okay, so same thing here with the Ottomans. The Ottomans are going to establish provincial governors with provinces or territories. And these governors are known as beys. Okay, so y'all may remember Osman Bey. Okay, the original sultan. Bey wasn't his last name, it was his title. He was a chief. So now we have these beys or chiefs who rule over these individual territories, and they report back to the sultan. Okay, so what are these chiefs' jobs? Well, they're supposed to collect taxes. They get to keep a little bit of the taxes for themselves, but then they send the bulk of that money back to Istanbul, back to the main government, because they're supposed to report back to the sultan. Okay, but in their territories, they hold political control and military control over the smaller tribes and villages that make up their territories. Okay, but whatever the sultan says, like, hey, this is a new law or this is a new tax, the governors or beys have to follow. Now, eventually, this system is going to become corrupt. As the sultans become weaker, okay, as they hold less power and clout, the governors are going to say, well, they can't make me send all this tax money to Istanbul. And so there's going to be increased levels of corruption where the beys start keeping more and more for themselves instead of sending it back to the main treasury. Okay, but at first, this system is going to work very well. Instead of one person trying to control a huge expanse of territory, he puts officials in place to rule over smaller sections of territory for him, but report back to him. Okay, so this is going to allow the Ottoman Empire to last as long as it did, because it is going to be centralized in this manner. Another factor that contributed to how long the Ottoman Empire was able to survive was the fact that they were religiously tolerant. Okay, the Ottoman Empire was very religiously and ethnically diverse. Okay, and so if you want to prevent rebellion or to prevent revolts, then it kind of helps to not oppress people. Okay, and so the Ottoman Empire is going to be tolerant towards Jewish populations and Christian populations, allowing them to live in millets or autonomous communities within the Ottoman Empire, allowing them to keep their traditions and their language and their culture and their religion, so long as they pay the jizya tax. Okay, and people are a lot less likely to revolt if you don't oppress them. So the Christians and the Jewish population were free to worship as they liked as long as they paid a tax, and so they were cool with the government. This is going to be in direct contrast to the Safavid. The Safavid were not chill when it came to religion. They weren't like, oh, you're Sunni, that's fine, or oh, you're Christian, that's fine. They wanted everybody to be Shia Muslim. They wanted everybody to follow their imam. Okay, and so that's going to be one of the factors that leads to the Safavid Empire being so short-lived, because they were so strict about the one religion they wanted everybody to follow that eventually people are going to revolt and overthrow them, like with the Sunni Pashtuns who overthrow the Safavid Empire. Okay, but the Ottoman Empire, they were chill. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Jewish people and the Christians were considered equal to the Muslims. They weren't persecuted or oppressed, but they also were pushed out of certain areas in government. All of the elite positions in the government were held by Muslims. The Sultan was always a Muslim. The Vizier was always a Muslim. The military soldiers are always Muslim. So they weren't able to rise to positions of prominence because they were not a part of the official government's religion. Okay, but they were not persecuted for being a different religion than Sunni Muslim. Now, why would these beys collect these taxes and send them back to the government? What do they get in exchange for that? Well, they do get some money and some territory. Okay, this is similar to the system of feudalism that we see emerge in Europe. Y'all may remember that in Europe, the king had a lot of land, so he would give land to his vassals, and then what would the vassals give the king in exchange? Knights, okay, military support. So if I'm the king and I give all of you land, and then I want to declare war against Miss McIntyre, because I gave y'all land, y'all now have to give me soldiers. So I guess like your pet dogs and cats, we're gonna win this war, okay? And so the same thing is going to emerge in the Ottoman Empire. The beys received land known as fiefs or fiefdoms in exchange for providing military support to the Sultan. So it's that same triangular hierarchy that we've talked about in every culture and empire that we've ever discussed. There's one person at the top, and then there's a hierarchy underneath them. You have the nobles with land and wealth and thus power, and they have manors. And then underneath them, you have the knights. Underneath them, you have merchants. And at the bottom, you have peasants and serfs. Same thing is going to emerge in the Ottoman Empire. So when these beys receive these fiefdoms and they start raising taxes, who do you think they're going to be taxing the most? Are they going to be taxing the wealthy or the people with the least amount of money? The poor, exactly right. They're going to be taxing the people with the least amount to give. And like what we saw in France, this is going to end in revolution. So we talked before about how politics in the Ottoman Empire could get messy and a little bit deadly. Y'all may remember that dating back to Mehmed II, sultans were legally allowed to kill all of their siblings. Okay, once they took the throne, they were allowed to kill all of their brothers because they were threats to them. Because remember, the Ottoman Empire didn't pick its next leader based on primogeniture. Primogeniture was a European thing, where the next person in line is always the eldest son. Now, in the Ottoman Empire, it was going to be a son that took over for the father, but didn't necessarily have to be the first son or the oldest son. It could be the favorite son. And so as a result of this, you have some bloody conflicts within the palace. Okay, the princes had to be kept protected under lock and key to prevent assassination. This means that they are not going to get a lot of education and experience in leadership, which leads to them being very weak and ineffective rulers. The sultans themselves are at risk for assassination. And so they can't just go out in public all willy-nilly without protection, because that's a threat to their life. And if they die, then there's going to be some palace intrigue over who's supposed to rule after them. And so in order to minimize the threat of assassination, the sultans establish a new position, a position of chief minister. All right, and the term for this is a vizier. A vizier spoke on behalf of the sultan. So they are the sultan's mouthpiece. They're the ones who go out in public and say, hey, the sultan just raised taxes to this amount. Or hey, the sultan wants us to invade this territory next. The sultan himself isn't going out and saying it because someone might kill him to death until he dies, which would be bad for the government. If the vizier gets assassinated, well, he can just pick another vizier. It'd be fine. And so in order to prevent assassination, the sultan creates a new position. And this vizier is supposed to speak on behalf of the sultan. Yes, Nikhil, the Abbasids did have viziers, and this is going to actually lead to corruption within the government, because as those princes that you remember were so weak and protected and they didn't have a lot of experience, as those princes become sultans, the viziers are going to start exerting their control over those sultans. Okay, so the viziers go from being the mouthpiece of the sultan to actually ruling, whereas the sultans go off and do other things to distract them. Okay, so they kind of take over that power structure. In addition to the viziers competing with power, y'all may remember that the ulama were competing for power in the government. The janissaries were competing for power in the government, but those are all men. Okay, what about women? What role did women play in politics? Well, this is where we turn to harem politics. Even though women didn't directly rule, they were able to influence the government and society indirectly through their roles at the court. Okay, because a harem was where the girlfriends and wives of the sultan lived, and they all had a chance to produce an heir. It wasn't necessarily the firstborn son that would be the next sultan. It could be any of their sons. And so they would start promoting their own children for that role of the next sultan, okay, which also contributed more to palace intrigue and assassination attempts as they turned each other's children against each other. So this is all one big cluster. This is a lot of palace intrigue. You've got princes being raised in such a way that they're not going to be good rulers. You have viziers who are starting to take over more and more power. You have harem politics going on with like different chess pieces being moved strategically for this political game. And you also have fights between the ulama and the janissaries. Okay, all of this is going to contribute to the eventual decline of the Ottoman government. Okay, increased corruption and decreased competency. And while the Ottoman Empire is on the decline, the European empires are hitting their stride. They're going into their golden ages. Now, y'all may remember that prior to 1492, the Ottomans controlled a lot of trade. Okay, the Ottoman Empire controlled land routes and sea routes. They controlled the Silk Road, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Indian Ocean. So if the Europeans wanted those sweet, sweet spices, they would have to go through these monopolies. And so the Ottomans would be able to tax them at a high amount. They played the role of middlemen. And so they were able to jack up prices because they held a monopoly. All of that changed when the Portuguese found a route to Africa. Now, how did that happen? How did the Portuguese find a route around Africa? Who were some key historical figures involved in that?
Was it Prince Henry and his school?
Exactly right. So Prince Henry the Navigator established the School for Navigation. Neither of y'all mentioned Bartholomew Diaz. That's another key character, although Vasco da Gama is probably more important. So Prince Henry the Navigator, like Lauren said, established the School for Navigation, established port cities along the western coast of Africa. Bartholomew Diaz charted a route halfway around Africa. He got to the tip of Africa before he had to turn back. Vasco da Gama, like Nikhil said in the chat, went the entire way. He went all the way from Portugal to Asia, going around Africa. Now that Portugal has a route to the spice trade, they don't have to go through the Ottoman routes. And so the Ottomans lose that monopoly. They no longer control Indian Ocean trade routes, hence the beginning of the Portuguese Golden Age. But they weren't the only European country that started getting involved in these trade routes. What was the other European country that began its Golden Age after 1492? Spain, exactly right. But they didn't go south like the Portuguese did. Instead, they went west and landed in the New World. Okay, so the Europeans are going to have all of this gold and silver and cash crops coming into their economy. And so the Europeans are going to get really, really powerful. They're going to get swole. Okay, whereas the Ottoman Empire has started to become weaker and weaker following the death of Suleiman. After Suleiman's death, the Spanish actually defeat the Ottoman Empire in a major naval battle. Okay, so you can mark the decline of the Ottoman Empire with the death of Suleiman. Okay, so the Spanish, which remember they are Catholic, and the Venetians, okay, the city of Venice, it's a city-state in Italy. Technically, Italy isn't a country yet, not until 1870. So it's the Italian city-states. But one of the major merchant city-states was the city of Venice. And so the Venetians and the Spanish are going to team up together to defeat the Ottoman Empire in the Battle of Lepanto, and that's in 1571. So in addition to losing the Indian Ocean trade routes to the Portuguese, now the Ottoman Empire also lost the Mediterranean sea routes for trade. So both of those monopolies lost within the same century. So this is going to contribute to the declining economy of the Ottoman Empire, thus the declining empire in and of itself. So following Suleiman's death, let's say you have an SAQ or an essay that said, and you made a claim that following Suleiman's death, the Ottoman Empire declined. Well, you're going to need some evidence to back that up. You can't just say, oh, Suleiman died and then everything went bad. Okay, what evidence do you have to back up the fact that after Suleiman's death, the Ottoman Empire was in the decline? Well, the Battle of Lepanto is an excellent example. Suleiman's dead. The Ottoman Empire squares up against Spain and the Venetians, and they lose in 1571. Okay, that is a piece of evidence that backs up your claim. What's the historical significance of this decline? Well, the Spanish were able to take over the Mediterranean sea lanes, and the Portuguese were able to take over the Indian Ocean trade lanes, which made European on the rise and the Muslim gunpowder empires on the decline. And they're going to continue to take advantage of the Ottoman Empire during this decline. Okay, the Ottoman Empire becomes known as the sick man of Europe because it's not a rapid decline. It's not like Suleiman the Magnificent died and then within a couple of years the Ottoman Empire was gone. It took centuries for them to fall. It took them 300 years longer to fall following Suleiman's death. Someone asked, the Spanish took over which trade route? The Mediterranean Sea. The Portuguese took over the Indian Ocean trade lanes. The Spanish took over the Mediterranean sea lanes in conjunction with the Venetians. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire is going to fall victim to two things. Weak sultans. And why were the sultans weak? Well, because they were sheltered. There were so many assassination attempts that they didn't get a lot of experience in the real world. They were kept in the palace under lock and key. Then there's corruption with the viziers taking over and ruling instead of the sultans. There's revolts by the janissaries to end the devshirme system. Okay, so they had weak sultans, weak leadership. And at the same time that they were weakening, the Europeans were getting stronger. So they fell victim to weak sultans and strong European neighbors, hence the moniker or nickname Sick Man of Europe. Okay, so other pieces of evidence showing the decline of the Ottoman Empire by the 1600s. They lost trade routes. They lost the Indian Ocean to Portugal. They lost the Mediterranean Sea to Spain and Venice. They had too much territory. They had gotten too large, and their bureaucracy could not control that much territory. The peasants were revolting because of increased taxes. Why were taxes being increased? Because they were only taxing the poor people, so they weren't making enough tax revenue in the first place. That, in conjunction with losing their economic monopolies, is going to be a big financial blow to the Ottoman Empire. And then, of course, corruption. As the sultans weakened, the provincial governors, the beys, started taking more and more of that tax money for themselves. Instead of tax farming and giving most of the money back to the government, they started taking more and more for themselves to enrich themselves individually. The end result of which is after World War I, by 1923, the Ottoman Empire is no more. It's officially over. And its remains become the country of Turkey. Okay, so this is all that remains of the once mighty Ottoman Empire. But wait, what happened to all that other land that had been a part of Ottoman territory? Well, we're now in the time period of new imperialism. Okay, new imperialism was between 1750 and 1900. Okay, so as a result of that, we see this territory that used to belong to the Ottomans being carved up and given to who? The Europeans. Remember that in old imperialism, it was Europeans conquering New World. In new imperialism, it's Europeans conquering the Old World, namely Africa and Asia. So all of this territory across these three continents that used to belong to the Ottomans, now it's split up amongst the Europeans. And you don't really need to know which areas went to who. I mean, obviously the British and the Russians and the French, they're all going to be carving up these areas into their spheres of influence. But you don't need to specifically say like, oh, the British took over the Middle East, okay? Or, oh, the French took over the northern coast of Africa. Really, the most important areas that we need to know about are India being conquered by the British under new imperialism. So we're very slowly moving into period 3. And y'all may have noticed that your smart book for Russia covered topics in the 1900s like imperialism and industrialization and the revolution of 1905. And that's because y'all are studying for the AP exam. I don't know if I've already said this, but whatever we cover in lecture, that's what's going to be tested on in the class. If there's information covered in the smart books that's not in the lecture, well, then that's something for the AP exam.